Hello and welcome back to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology. I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and today I'm at my office at the University of Valley Forge where I do some counseling, and this is going to be another one of my Reflessions, where I reflect upon a therapy session I had and expound upon some counseling concept. So today I want to talk about a client I saw last week, who I saw just a few times at the end of last semester, and he returned this semester, and he just it became really apparent last semester and again with this past session that he is just almost a textbook case of object relations. So I wanted to use his story or the discussion we had this past session to illustrate that. So let me start with what our discussion was, and I'll try to make sure not to share any details that would identify who he is as best as I can. So, like I said, I saw him last semester for a few sessions, and then we have off during the summertime, and so now he's returned. So I was asking about his summer, how it was going, and he was trying to live out in this area where the school is, instead of returning home, which is further away and doesn't really like his home environment. His parents are divorced and has some conflicts with his mom that we got into a little bit last semester. So he was working at a restaurant and trying to live on his own out here, and then he got fired and ended up having to move back home. So I was asking, well, what happened? And he starts going on about pretty much blaming his coworkers. He wasn't really he wasn't seeing how he played any role in what got him laid off. He was like, well, my coworkers, they had it out for me in some way. They just were disrespectful toward me. They treated me like a kid. They accused me of not working. Like when they would see me, they just caught me at times when I was standing, not doing anything, and that was because I was just being efficient. I did this and this and this. I didn't feel the need to drive myself crazy. Like the things they cared about were not things that mattered to me, or they just weren't that important, so I wasn't going to go crazy over these things. I was just going to do my job, do it well, and do it quickly and efficiently, and not stress out. And so his coworkers didn't like him. So management eventually was like, well, you're just not a good fit, so we're going to have to let you go. And that was that. So I was like, well, can you give me an example, a story that illustrates this? So he started telling me a story about this time. He messed up on an order, but he figured out there's a way I could fix this or rectify this for this customer. I just need the bartender to do me a certain favor, to prepare something for me. And the bartender didn't understand it, what he was asking, and so she didn't want to do it. And so he walked away from that conversation angry, and she got the impression that he was blaming her for his mistake, and so she had some comments for him at the end of the shift, and he tried to explain to her, no, I'm not blaming you, I just need you to do this favor, but it's okay, I figured it out some other way. If you don't want to help me, fine, I'll figure it out another way. So she wasn't being helpful to him. And so once again, he was being blamed, being accused of not doing his job right, or not working, and he was feeling like they didn't understand him, they didn't respect him. So as he started telling me this story, he even stopped himself, and he's like, this isn't even a good example. I don't know why I shared this story. So he told me some other examples here and there, but that was the main story he got into as an example, and he didn't think it was a good example. So anyway, he ended up having moved back home with his mom and her boyfriend. And his mom, he had described her to me last semester as manipulative and discouraging, and there'd be times where she would provoke an argument just to see him get angry and then record him and post it on social media and get people to pretty much like expose their tiff out in public like that. So not a very good relationship with his mom. Now he's in college pursuing a career in the arts, and his mom trying to discourage him from going to that. She trying to encourage him to go down some other career path that she believes would be more lucrative. She wants him to do something more financially stable. And so even when he was visiting, she even told him things like, hey, I tried sharing one of the pieces that you created and no one liked it. And why is that? Why does no one like this? And he's like, I've shared it with other people, all my classmates, my professors like it. And when I share my stuff, people like it. So she's discouraging him in that aspect. And what seems to be the case is with the endeavors he's pursuing, she doesn't see it as valuable. So he explained a little bit more about her background, a very rough background, and she passed on this sort of unspoken rule, or even a spoken rule that was in her upbringing, and that was that you're worth what you work. And it was so ingrained at home that your only value is when you are doing something that shows physical exertion. Like, you're not really working if you're not physically working, if you're not doing some sort of manual labor. So pursuing a career in the arts, she doesn't see as actual work. So, and that means you're also not valuable. You're not worth anything if you're not working. But the definition of work is very limited. So he's going into this for like the next 20 minutes of the session about how he grew up with that sense that you're only worth what you work, and he got sick of it. He's very resistant toward that, and so I asked him, I'm making these connections, as I'm sure you are, so I'm like, well, how does this relate to what happened at the restaurant? And he pauses, and he's actually thinking about it, which is really good to see. And this is not something that you see all the time, but he does have this epiphany. And he's like, wow, am I resisting work because my mom just drilled this down into us and beat it into us that you're only worth what you work? And is that why I just cut corners at work? And like, I'm just acting out my relationship with my mom, with my coworkers. So he's like, am I always going to be that way? Like, am I always going to be resistant to work? And if I don't see the value in what they see, that I'm just not going to do it? So look, the proof is in the pudding now, where he's now working a job where he works totally by himself. He works for himself. He found some way to make money on his own, where he doesn't have to be accountable to anyone. He doesn't have anyone else's standards to live up to. So, and going into the arts, you can very much be your own person. And so this was a discussion we got into last semester as well, where I tried to explain to him, even in the arts, there are times where you're going to have to work with others, or even work for someone. Maybe you're producing something for someone, and they want it a certain way, and they have these specifications, and they're things that you don't care about, but you're choosing to work for them. So you have to make yourself care about them. But if you have this issue where you're so resistant to meeting someone else's standards, you're going to have a lot of conflict in your career. So, because even as an artist, you can't work by yourself entirely. So, there's the story. There's the conversation we had. Okay. So, object relations. That'll be our topic for today. So first thing to understand about object relations is that they are a modern version of psychodynamic theory. So first, real quickly, what are psychodynamics? So psychodynamic theories are the group of psychotherapeutic theories based upon the unconscious. They're considered depth psychology. Okay? So psychodynamics, it means the dynamics of the psyche, the unconscious processes and interactions that affect our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, our psyche, which is your soul, your feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Okay? The first of the psychodynamic theories was Freud and his psychoanalysis. That's the most famous, and it's the first one, and really it's actually the first of the models of psychotherapy, because Freud was the father of modern psychotherapy. And Freud's theory was that what really drives us is our biological drives for sex, pleasure, and aggression, sex slash pleasure. So I'm not going to go into psychoanalysis or Freud that much, but his theory was very Darwinian. It's like what drives us is, if you think about it, the survival for the fittest, of the fittest. So sex and pleasure, people get confused with that. They think he's obsessed with sex, maybe to an extent, but you have to understand that sex for him was symbolic of pleasure, which further is symbolic of survival, because this is when you get to study the brain, you see how true this is. Your brain, particularly your limbic system, your lower brain, your emotional core, interprets anything that's pleasurable as being important for survival, which makes sense. If it tastes good, if it feels good, then it must be good for you. So early in life, you encode things that you experience as pleasurable as being important for survival, and your brain prioritizes survival, because your brain is all about making sure you as the organism survive and you live. Okay, aggression would be the other major thing, but not as important to him as sex slash pleasure. Okay, but aggression, because once again, survival of the fittest. You have to fight. You have to fight for dominance or survival. Okay, so that's psychodynamics. Okay, now what is object relations? So that's a modern psychodynamic theory based in attachment theory. Okay, remember Freud's theory based on biological drives for pleasure and aggression. So that's what he believed was our prime motivator. But as we started to learn more, there was another theory that developed called attachment theory that said, no, we don't think that our prime motivator is pleasure or aggression, but rather attachment. So what is attachment? Attachment is a significant connection and identification with another person, with another figure that is important to you, particularly important to your survival, to your development. So, i.e., your primary caregiver. So attachment starts with your mother, and then it involves your father and other important people in your life. So attachment theory is like what really motivates us is connection with others. So that's the attachment theory, and that helped people develop a new version of psychodynamic therapy that was developed by actually a few people, but one of the big names would be Althea Horner. And here's her book, Psychoanalytic Object Relations Therapy. So I was trained in psychodynamic therapy in my graduate school training, as well as family systems. So, but I'm still very multimodal. I don't just use that approach, but it very much informs what I do. So it's a good basis, but it's not very intervention heavy. So I'm still learning a lot about how to use interventions, because most of what you do in psychoanalysis and object relations is the relationship itself is the intervention. So anyway, so what is object relations then? Okay, so first, what is an object? An object is the mental image of an early significant attachment figure. So your mom, your dad, and then maybe any others that were crucial to your development. So it's from childhood. So primarily your object is going to be your parents. Okay. Then you have your mental image of yourself. You got two mental images. You have the object, which is the internalization of a caregiver. And then you have yourself. Now these are unconscious. And the objects, these are not necessarily authoritative or objective. It's kind of a weird term. Object, you think objective, but no. The development of the object is an entirely subjective process. So it could be a snapshot of this person that gets ingrained, or a series of interactions that were really impactful, that get ingrained. Patterns, habits, things that have meaning, that get ingrained and just internalized. But the object doesn't necessarily see that person in their totality. It can't, especially when you're developing this so early in life. The child doesn't know everything about their parents, just knows how they're perceiving them in their interactions with the child. Okay? So when I'm working with clients, I'm working with them and their objects. I'm not working with the actual people from their life. And I'm not a detective. It's not my job to figure out what the truth necessarily is, but to still work with them on how they view those early relationships. Okay? So anyway, the way this object develops is through interpersonal interactions early in childhood. We're talking from infancy through the play age. By like age 8 or so, the object is pretty much set in stone. It has some flexibility, so it keeps developing, but for the most part, by your play age, that object is pretty much set, at least for those primary caregivers. Okay? So the interpersonal interactions then form these internal representations, and then you have these internal or intrapsychic systems and processes. It's like this whole world inside your mind. Well, then that manifests again in future interpersonal relationships and interactions with others, particularly other people that are more important. So the more important the relationship, then the more the object will play a role. Okay? The less action in a weird way, the less objective the relationship becomes. It becomes more subjective the closer it gets. So there's a connection there between intimacy and subjectivity. The more intimate the relationship, the more subjective. So this is the process of how objects form. Interpersonal becomes internal, which then becomes interpersonal again. Okay? So how do these object relations play out in life? So you have in your mind what object relations are is the unconscious, the interplay between yourself, your mental image of yourself, and the object, mental image of your primary caregiver. So that's what the object relations are. These internal object relations form the template for all other relationships. So these determine your feelings, fears, expectations, your beliefs and assumptions about people, your wishes, what you hope to get out of a relationship or an interaction with someone, and your behaviors, how you want to act around that person or toward that person, as long as it's an important relationship, right? And these object relations are enduring. They're formed early in life, and then they become unconscious, so you're not thinking about them necessarily in a conscious way. So they impact you and influence you in ways you're not even aware of. And so they're enduring, they last a while, and they're difficult to change. Okay, once something reaches the lower, is formed in the lower brain, and it becomes reinforced through more behaviors, more interactions, it's very difficult to change that. So you think about this from a biblical or a Christian point of view, this is how generational curses get passed down. So with my client, you see that the object of his mom was one where she saw his value only in how he works, in putting forth physical exertion, and that if he wasn't doing something physical, then he wasn't truly working, and therefore he has no value. And if that's being pushed on him enough times, he will get resistant. At least that's with his personality type. There's other factors to include with that sort of object, and maybe another personality type, he might just be more compliant and very passive, and just go along with everything. But with this client, his personality type, very independent, stubborn, he will be resistant, which actually in a way manifests in passivity still. because in his job he became passive by not taking responsibility. So he wasn't taking responsibility for his actions, what led to his firing, as well as not taking responsibility by taking initiative and going above and beyond. He was just doing bare minimum what he had to do so he wouldn't stress himself out. Because it was so instilled in him that you have to exert yourself, you have to exhaust yourself to be considered really working, that he had enough. Enough is enough. He would still do his work. It wasn't that he wasn't working, but it wasn't to the level that his other coworkers valued, and they valued things that he didn't think were important. So you see that because he didn't resolve these issues with his mother, they get passed on into these other interactions with other relationships, and this is just at work. Not necessarily a super important relationship, but can you imagine how this would play out in a dating relationship, in a marriage relationship, in a long-term working relationship with a coworker? So obviously he's going to resist having obligations to others, so that's why he's now working by himself, doing a job where he's not accountable to anyone, except maybe that customer he has for that brief moment. So you see how this plays out. If he doesn't resolve this issue, it's going to get passed on because it got passed on to him because his mom grew up in a situation where it was drilled into her that you have to physically exert yourself in order to be valuable, and where it got to the point of being abusive. And so she passed on part of that, and he's going to pass it on in some way. Maybe not the exact form because he's so resistant to it, but it's still going to have a negative impact. He's not going to pass on a healthy view of work to his children if he has children. So this is how you see how object relations are enduring and difficult to change. They are rooted in the unconscious, and they play out in different ways, but they will play out. You not being conscious of something doesn't mean it's not affecting you in some way. It's going to impact your life, whether you're aware of it or not. So this brought to mind a passage, as I was thinking about this client, of a passage that I would say is very misunderstood and misused, and that is Proverbs 22:6, which says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. Okay? When I say that this is a passage that is misused a lot, I would say it's because we use this as a passage to encourage parents when their child walks away from the faith and just gives up on church, gives up on God. We say, well, no, you brought them to church. You made sure they said the sinner's prayer. They made a confession of faith at one point. Don't worry, they can live like a heathen right now, but they'll come back. Don't worry, they'll come back. And that's what we use to try to assure people of that. But I don't think that's what that passage is about at all. So let's look at some of the key words here. So to train up, the Hebrew word is kanak. To put something in the mouth. Literally what that means is to put something in the mouth. Okay? So that's literally what it means, and that actually has some very symbolic meaning. So it means to feed someone. Well, what's it mean to eat? Symbolically, to eat means to learn, to acquire knowledge. And when you acquire knowledge, you're taking something that's outside of you, you're putting it inside of you, and it becomes part of you. Like you're taking the nutrients from food so that it becomes part of your own body. That's learning. That's integrating things that are outside of you to make you better and healthier. Okay? Or to make you unhealthy, because you could be ingesting things that are not good for you, and your body will absorb those as well. So your training up could be healthy or unhealthy. Okay? The term is objective, is neutral. But also, it means from the mouth, means from the start. Okay? It's from the beginning. So to start up, the word kanak means not just to train up, but to start up. So start your children on the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not turn from it. So it's emphasizing that from an early age, your children are forming these associations, and they're learning things, and we learn very little by what we're told. We learn way more by how you interact with us and what you model. So we learn way more on a nonverbal level. And when you think nonverbal, think unconscious. So it's through time spent with someone that things are transferred in an emotional, even spiritual way that can't be put into words. You learn things from time spent with your parents that you can't just learn by being told. So this is a very important concept, okay? All right, the other key word, in the way he should go, the way. I think the one commentary I saw was the Hebrew word derek. I hope that's correct. And that would be according to his way. Now there's a couple interpretations out there. Does it mean according to your faith, according to doctrine? Or another view out there is that, no, it means you should train up a child according to that child's temperament, faculties, abilities, needs, individual considerations. And that is the way that they should go. When you train them up according to their individualized considerations, then that will lead them up to become the person that God has designed them to be. So maybe correct. The other one maybe is, train them according to your doctrine, according to your requirements, and when you sort of impose that upon the child, then that they won't veer from that. Okay? So those are the two main sort of conflicting views on the interpretation of that passage. Okay. I'm going to offer a bit of an alternative view on that. And that is starting with, how are we reading the Proverbs? Are we reading them as prescriptions or descriptions? I'm going to posit that probably most, there's a mix. They're wisdom literature, so that means they are imparting advice. So there are a lot of prescriptive proverbs. But another way of looking at the Proverbs is that they are ancient forms of psychological observation. So we tend to think that psychology didn't really begin until the 1800s, late 1800s. And that science didn't really begin until the 1600s or so. So we get this idea that a real scientific model of psychology is a recent thing. Maybe so, because we've grown our discipline of observation. But if we understand that science at its core is discipline observation, especially when you're talking about psychological science, then we've actually been doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years as humans. So when you see that, you can see how a lot of the Proverbs are not necessarily prescriptions, but they're descriptions. That's why a lot of them, you would say, they're not hard and fast rules. They're generalizations. Well, they're generalized because the one writing the proverb is observing humans. He's observing nature. He's observing how people are, and making some generalized conclusions about what he's observing. That's descriptive. So now from that, can you get an instruction? So there's this mantra going around that you cannot get an ought from an is. And I would say, if you're coming from a purely materialistic, naturalist worldview, yeah, I would say that is correct. You cannot get an ought from an is if you're going to have that worldview. It's just, you observe all sorts of things, and all those things are arbitrary. But if you understand that we have a creator who designed us a certain way and has a will and a telos, a purpose, then when you see an is that seems to be the most universal, then we can get a hint at what the ought is. You can get a hint at what the purpose is. So even though they may be descriptions, we can get a prescription based off these descriptions in the Proverbs. So when we start to see that it's just a description, Like, if we reinterpret this verse, Proverbs 22:6, that train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are older they will not turn from it, as a description, boy, that comes with some prescriptions right there. A warning. Be careful how you raise your kids. Be careful what sort of object they may be forming in their minds. The object that they have of you, is it going to be helpful? Or is it going to be something that is punitive all the time, or critical and not encouraging them? Is it going to be one that seems distant and aloof or uncaring? They're forming these objects based on early interactions because it's from the start. And these are enduring. They're not going to turn from it. Like, in general, people are not going to turn from these. So if you're living an unconscious life, I mean, you're not really doing a hard work of examining your emotions and your objects, and really coming to greater awareness of your unconscious processes, you're living unconsciously, then you're not going to turn from these unconscious processes. And that's what I would say is what helps to drive these generational curses, we call them. So with my client, he's now working for himself. He can't stand working for people. He's resistant to rules or requirements or other people's demands. He's so resistant to them that he will not even do the work, and he will slack off. So you see how he's been living unconsciously at work, and it's because of the object relations that he has. So what are the solutions? Okay. So just as the objects were formed through close interpersonal, emotional relationships, like I said, it's through the time spent, through these interactions, nonverbal things are learned. They're formed non-verbally, unconsciously. So just as they're formed that way, they're going to be healed in the same way. And new objects must be formed in deep, emotionally attuned relationships. So, best example would be the therapeutic relationship. But that's not the only example. There could be other positive relationships someone could have that could help do a work on someone's objects, like a healthy marriage, which is difficult to have if you haven't started the work of going through your objects. So, because then you got someone else's, their object relations, meaning your object relations, and there might be a reason why you meet. We'll get into that another time. I would recommend checking out imago therapy for a good description of how object relations play out in relationships. I'll get into that at some point as well. But maybe through a mentorship relationship, a teacher, a pastor, not just counselor. Like, it doesn't just have to be counseling. Through a healthy friendship, some of these things can start working out. But it's going to get to the point where it requires some effort and a lot of introspection and making the effort to form healthier relationships and being willing to confront those emotions, turn the light on in that darkness, that unconscious. And this has both this is a merge or a meeting of your cognitive and your emotional sides, because you're going to do some work, but the bulk of it's going to happen on that unconscious emotional level. And there's this happens horizontally with other humans and vertically. So as believers, we have this hope that even though we have flawed, imperfect parents and caregivers that form these unhealthy object relations, or we form them maybe just through our misperceptions of things, but they're flawed nonetheless, and our object relations sort of got corrupted in some way. We fortunately have a Heavenly Father who is perfect, and we need to spend time with Him as well. Because even the other people, I'm going to fail as a therapist, your pastor's going to fail, your teacher's going to fail, your wife, your spouse is going to fail. So horizontally, there are limits, but we have a Heavenly Father that also, through intimacy with Him, our emotions and those object relations can transform, and we can form a new object. We can integrate within ourselves a new object of God in our relationship with Him. It takes time, it takes effort, it to develop that relationship. So some of the main goals in this process, such as with my client, will be to increase his awareness of these processes. Because as he brought this up, he's like, oh my gosh, like, what am I going to do with this? Doesn't mean I'm doing this all the time. I'm like, well, all right, we're going to increase your awareness of this. And we provide some interpretation. So as I asked him that question, do you see a connection between what you're telling me about your mother and what happened at your job? Because it was interesting, he did not see the connection at the beginning, because he thought that the story he was sharing with me was a bad example, but it was actually a perfect example once he started telling me about his relationship with his mother. And it was blind to him until I asked him, and he gave it some serious thought. I have plenty of other clients when you ask that question and they don't see it. You can see these connections and they don't see it. And as a counselor, you got to use wisdom, because you may see things right away, but it may not be wise for you to share it just yet. The client you have to sort of prime that relationship. That's why it's best to have counseling on a regular basis, frequently. It's difficult. Say I'm seeing a lot of clients every other week because they can't afford to come more often. So it makes this work very difficult, because it's like you're sort of starting over every session. So if he's doing this work on his own as well, by doing a lot of introspection, that helps. So as you come with these interpretations, then you integrate. And you start seeing the threads, you see these connections, and you integrate them all together. You see that, wait, my relationships at work, my relationships in my family of origin, my relationship with my girlfriend, they're not disconnected. They're not disparate. There's a common thread between all of them. And when you make those connections, you integrate them, and you start to see, this all goes back to this early relationship. And what also will happen is, as you develop an awareness of your object relations and how they play out in your relations, this will help you to have compassion for, one, yourself, and when you make mistakes, when you fail in these areas, as well as compassion for that early caregiver, for that relationship that formed that negative object. Because there's reasons why like his mother, there are reasons why she treated him a certain way, or treats him a certain way. And he won't be able to heal until he gets to a point of being able to forgive. And forgiveness, the emotional aspect of forgiveness, is going to be very difficult if he does not develop compassion for her and realize that, you know what, she was just working through and acting out and reenacting the object relations she had, just in the same way I've been acting out and reenacting my object relations. So one of the byproducts of working through this stuff will be, hopefully, compassion, because that's going to release a greater level of healing when you can work through compassion, work on forgiveness at an emotional level. So those are my thoughts on this recent session, and gives me a little bit of a blueprint of how I'm going to proceed with this client as well, just as I'm talking it out here. So if you have thoughts, please comment below. Please share this video, and if you disagree, let me know. If you want to see more content like this, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. God bless.